Bruh, I feel like I literally just did my January wrap-up. Can your boy catch a break? Bibliophiles of the internet, my name is Adri, and today I'm here to bring you my February wrap-up. As you may know, February is Black History Month here in the US, and therefore also Blackathon, which is a month-long readathon created by Jesse of Bow Ties and Books, encouraging people to read Black authors all month long, which is exactly what I did. So let's jump right in. The first book I read for the month was Happily Ever Afters by Eliza Bryant. It's an Own Voices YA contemporary story about Tessa Johnson, a young biracial Black girl who writes romance stories and has just been accepted into a prestigious creative writing program, but when she goes to her first workshop, she suddenly has no idea what to write. Luckily, her best friend has the perfect solution and tells Tessa all she has to do is fall in love herself, so they come up with a list of steps to help Tessa towards her own happily ever after based on popular romance book tropes. Content warnings for instances of ableism and ableist language from supporting characters, some allusions to infidelity, incurred racism, extensive HP references, and what I have to assume was the accidental dead naming of a famous trans person. I do want to note up top that Tessa's brother has multiple disabilities, and while I can't speak to the quality of that representation, it is present, and I think the story does a fairly good job of challenging ableist rhetoric, which I do appreciate. I enjoyed this story, but I wasn't able to love it, and I think it's another case of missed opportunities. First of all, I was a bit disappointed in the direction the story took with its main plot hook, which is the list of classic romance tropes, because the person Tessa decides to try it out on is a complete jerk. And it would have been one thing for Tessa to gradually discover that as the story progresses, but you know he's a jerk from the very beginning, and he's also very much taken, so the audience knows that this effort is clearly wasted or at best misplaced. I love a good friends to lovers romance, which is kind of what's happening in the background, but it's a little excruciating to watch Tessa pursue someone she doesn't seem very interested in, someone who's not a nice person and who's already in a relationship. It just doesn't make sense. When you hear about this romance trope list, you expect there to be cuteness and shenanigans, but instead you can't even really enjoy it because it's being done for the wrong person, which kind of sucks. But even more than that, I think it was a missed opportunity to have some commentary about desirability and how the internalization of beauty standards and whiteness affects what we desire for ourselves, and how that especially impacts people of color in our interpersonal relationships. But instead it ends up feeling kind of reductive because Tessa's reasoning for pursuing this person is that he's just really hot. The other big missed opportunity I felt was how the story fails to address literary elitism, especially in creative spaces. The other part of this story is how Tessa has lost her inspiration to write and has fallen into a really bad case of writer's block, and she boils that down to being self-conscious and not having any experience sharing her work, which is valid, but I think that's only part of the conversation. The other part is that she specifically writes romances, and the fact is that romance and other genre fiction is not considered to be serious in its artistry and tends to be grossly undervalued, especially in workshops and review spaces. But that is never once addressed. Instead, Tessa just quietly decides to flunk the class. With that said, there is still plenty to enjoy in this story. It has a really soft actual love interest who loves baking. There's a great exploration of long-distance friendship, and I also appreciate how Tessa's family has a really open, supportive dynamic. I also kind of love how this story flips classic romance tropes like the grand gesture, the declaration of love, and the big reunion on their heads and reinterprets them in a completely different way. I do appreciate that kind of innovation, even though I think there needed to be a little bit more development for that to have the full desired impact. So it was definitely a story that had me going back and forth, and ultimately I gave it 3.5 stars. After that, I dove into my digital arc of Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert. This comes out on March 9th from Avon. It's the final book in the Brown Sisters trilogy, and it follows Eve, who is a fat Black British autistic woman who just had to shut down her wedding planning business after an embarrassing incident involving doves. Now her parents are worried that she's never going to find a suitable career path, and they basically give her an ultimatum about finding work. Feeling embarrassed and hopeless, she essentially runs away and comes across a small countryside town and decides to crash a job interview at a B&B because she has nothing else to lose. Eve ends up accidentally running over the controlling, domineering, also autistic B&B owner Jacob with her car and basically strong-arms her way into helping him run the B&B while he recovers from his injuries. Content warnings for instances of vehicular trauma, some graphic descriptions of injury including concussion, and some scenes containing graphic sex. This is such a delightful conclusion to the Brown Sisters trilogy. If you enjoyed Get a Life and Take a Hint, you will definitely enjoy this because it has more of that trademark crass humor, witty banter, and plenty of steamy romantic scenes. I really enjoyed the setup of this story because Eve really does run away to this picturesque small town and fakes her way into being a chef at this charming little bed and breakfast, and there's just something really soft and romantic about the actual setting itself. Again, I can't speak to the quality of the autism representation, but I appreciate how Jacob was very upfront and unashamed about his autism, how well he understands it as part of himself, and how he's factored that part of himself into how he runs his business. There's also a really great exploration of autism with Eve, who's slowly discovering that part of herself as the story continues, and there's also a bit of a conversation about how it's much harder for women to identify their autism and get that diagnosis. I also appreciate how Jacob and Eve both experience autism very differently. It's not that Eve begins to recognize herself in Jacob, because that's very much not the case, and I think it's important to show how autism doesn't just look like one thing and is very much not monolithic. It's a really funny, chaotic romance because Eve is a very headstrong, no-filter type person who knows how to get herself in and out of really sticky situations, and just like the previous books, it was nice to see these two go back and forth and slowly but surely lower each other's defenses. The grand gesture at the end was also really funny, and the story also culminates in a big family moment with all of Eve's sisters and their partners, who obviously you've grown to know and love from the previous books, so I appreciate the satisfaction of that full circle moment. My only issue with the story is that it begins with this fight between Eve and her parents, and even though they come to an understanding by the end, it never feels like the real underlying issue is ever resolved or addressed between them, so I was missing that last puzzle piece. Other than that, this was another solid romance from Talia Hibbert, whose backlist I will definitely be perusing after this. I wouldn't say this was my favorite of the trilogy, but I still gave it a solid 4 stars. Around the same time, I was also listening to Fledgling by Octavia Butler, read by Adenrele Ojo. Obviously, this is a classic Octavia Butler paranormal story. It's about a young girl named Shori who wakes up alone in the wilderness, severely injured and concussed, and with no memory of where she came from or who she is. Slowly, she's retracing her steps, and she discovers that she is a 53-year-old vampire and that her mother's village was destroyed by the same unknown assailants who now want to ensure that Shori and the rest of her clan are completely and forcibly wiped out. Content warnings for graphic descriptions of blood and injury, in-depth exploration of amnesia, graphic instances of death, mourning and grief, loss of family, trauma relating to fires and arson, murder, racism and racist slurs, some ableism, and some graphic depictions of sex. I haven't read one of Octavia's books in a while, so I went into this braced for something intimidating, but I quickly remembered that she writes in a very accessible way that appeals to human nature and human curiosity. Right from the first sentence, she drew me in because I instantly wanted to know what had happened to this person who was alone and dying in the forest. It's so easy to fall into the story because you know exactly how much is at stake. It's so interesting to see the complex nuances of Shori's memory, what she understands and recognizes even if she can't name those things, the extent of her instincts and how far she can get depending on them alone, but also the limitation of those instincts without context. That is one of the most powerful aspects of the story for me, the way that Shori is purposefully and forcefully disconnected from her family, from her history, and how she has to depend on the people around her to fill in those gaps and supply that knowledge that she should have inherited but ultimately lost. I was also really drawn to the way the story explores community and found family. The familial structures within the Ina community are really complex, and they're basically what a polyamorous family would look like in a functioning society. There's a really great exploration of mutualism, symbiosis, and a comprehensive look at shared space and bonds and resources. Those relationships are really powerful, and you don't get to see them in such an unstigmatized way very often, so I really appreciate that aspect. There's also an obvious allegory about race and racism because Shori is a black vampire and her dark skin gives her advantages in terms of strength and being able to withstand the sunlight, and the people who want her dead believe her to be too unnatural and different. So it's very much about being hunted, being persecuted, being provoked just for existing, and how that hatred from within her own community is yet another obstacle she has to overcome. So it's a really interesting story about survival, evolution, and found family, and it also kind of becomes a courtroom drama towards the end, which was a surprising but not unwelcome narrative shift. My only note is that there are some ableist undertones in the Ina community because basically they don't have a prison system or peacekeepers, so as punishment, the sentence is usually either death or dismemberment. The latter comes off as a bit ableist to me because the rationale is that the punishment needs to cause shame and inconvenience, and eventually the limbs would grow back anyways, so it doesn't really matter. While I can appreciate the author trying to be progressive by having this non-traditional metric for justice, that is many disabled people's reality that they can't just turn on and off with supernatural abilities, and there's nothing shameful about it. So I do wish there had been a little bit more thought in that regard, but this was still a great story that I enjoyed very much, and I gave it 4 stars. Then I finally got to read Ways to Make Sunshine by Renee Watson with illustrations by Nina Mata. It's an Own Voices contemporary middle grade story about Ryan, who is an outgoing, charismatic young chef, and her life turns upside down from when her dad gets a new job, and because it pays less than his old one, they have to downsize and move to a new house. Even though her brother can be annoying and her parents sometimes don't understand how scary change can be, Ryan has always been someone who tries to make sunshine out of setbacks. This is a really sweet and hopeful story for young readers. It's a book that nicely bridges the gap between chapter books and middle grade books. I don't say that as an indication of its quality, but just to give you a better idea of the intended audience. This is just a really fun slice of life type story where you're witnessing the family dynamic in Ryan's household. You see her mistakes and her triumphs and the everyday adventures she has with her family and friends. I think it's very much a story about facing things that are difficult and scary head on, and also finding what is special about you and how you can share that with other folks. I feel like it's also about how change is part of life, and it doesn't have to mean the end of life as you know it, but rather the opportunity to experience something new. And as long as you hold fast to love, there is nothing you can't face. It's a really cute, sweet story. My one critique, if it can be called that, is that the story is more of a series of vignettes rather than one overarching story arc, but I don't think the intended audience will care one lick about that. I still love this one, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I continued my middle grade kick with From the Desk of Zoe Washington by Janae Marks. It's another Own Voices contemporary middle grade story, coincidentally about another young black pastry chef named Zoe who receives a letter on her 12th birthday from her bio dad Marcus, who's currently in prison, and this is the first time they've ever had contact. Zoe begins writing him back and tentatively exploring that connection, and eventually tells her that he's serving a sentence for a crime he never committed, and he is in fact innocent. While her parents assume that she's preoccupied with her internship at a local bakery and perfecting a recipe for a Food Network audition, Zoe is actually hiding this correspondence and determined to do some investigating herself to find out the truth about Marcus. Content warnings for some brief, non-graphic references to murder, some instances of bullying, racism, and some allusions to racial slurs. I was blown away by this book. I knew I would enjoy it, but I really ended up loving it because it kind of has a little bit of everything. There's an element of social awakening and social justice, but there's also baking, complex friendships and relationships, and there's mystery and family secrets. Zoe is just now discovering and exploring her relationship with Marcus, and she wants to make that connection because he is part of her, but he's also in prison, which is heavily stigmatized, especially for black men. There's a lot of baggage that comes with his prison sentence, especially for Zoe's mom and grandmother, who both had relationships with Marcus before he was arrested, and the story meticulously parses through that baggage and allows the characters to have complicated feelings about it. Zoe is very loving and headstrong. She has ambition and drive, especially when it comes to baking and finding out more about Marcus's past. If no one is going to give her a direct path, she is going to make her own, and I think that's a really incredible trait. What I love most is that the overarching feeling emanating from this story is one of healing, love, and hopefulness. There is such a warmth and tenderness to the connection between Zoe and Marcus that is only made stronger by her desire to seek out justice. I appreciate that this story confronts the reality of systemic racism within the prison system and judicial system. It's really important that Zoe is coming to realize that what she's always been taught about living in a free, fair, and just society is false. And while that revelation could easily go down a dark and hopeless path, that only strengthens her resolve and shows her that this love and this family is worth fighting for no matter what. I really love this story. It's fun and hopeful, but it also confronts difficult realities and explores complex relationships. It was fantastic. I gave it 5 stars. Then on Angela's recommendation from Literature Science Alliance, I finally listened to Redemption in Indigo by Karen Lord, read by Robin Miles. It's a Caribbean-inspired fantasy adventure story with roots in mythology, almost like an original fairy tale of sorts, and it's about Pama, whose husband is selfish and gluttonous, and when she finally leaves him for good, she attracts the attention of the Jumbies, who present her with the Chaos Stick. Basically, the Chaos Stick allows her to manipulate things around her and perform magic. However, another Jumbi known as the Indigo Lord views this power as rightfully his, and he sets off to persuade Pama to return the stick. Content warnings for marital separation, some mentions of deadly disease, death, brief mention of suicide, some verbal allusions to non-graphic suicidal ideation, and some unchallenged fatphobic rhetoric. This is such a charming and whimsical story. It's pretty much like an original fairy tale rooted in Caribbean folklore, and the narration is very self-aware in such a fantastic way. It's fun to read because the narrator is very much conscious to and delighting within the storytelling process. My favorite part has to be the dynamic between the Indigo Indigo Lord and Palma, because it falls into that trope I love so much where the all-powerful god is supposed to be terrifying and dangerous, but they're completely disarmed when they confront a mortal who is headstrong and unimpressed by their nonsense. The two of them kind of go on this journey through time and space where the Indigo Lord is trying to show Palma the consequences of wielding the Chaos Stick and the hard choices that await her, and they begin to slowly change each other as they find a strange companionship within that journey. I just love the overall takeaway of the story, which is that even chaos answers to someone. Even chaos has to yield to greater forces, and one of the most powerful forces on Earth is change and chance. My one minor hang-up was that there were some fatphobic undertones in the story where Palma's husband was concerned. I thought that was unnecessary because there are a million things that can make someone unlikable or unpleasant, and I don't think one of those things is eating. I get that it was taken to an extreme for narrative purposes, but the problem also lies in that it was being played for comedic effect. That's just something to think about, but I still love this. It was really fun and refreshing and original, and I gave it 4.5 stars. After that, I practically flew through Charming as a Verb by Ben Philippe. It's an Own Voices contemporary YA romance and coming-of-age story about a young, charming Haitian-American boy named Henry. On the surface, he's the dutiful son of immigrants, trusted dog walker, and one of the most popular students at the prestigious academy known as Fate. But what most people don't know is that everything about him is a performance of sorts, and he uses his easy charm to cover up his burning ambition to attend Columbia, just like his father has always dreamt. When his classmate and neighbor Corinne discovers that his dog walking company is an elaborate scheme, she blackmails Henry into helping her improve her image at school, and what starts off as a mutual hustle might just blossom into romance. Content warnings for numerous HP references, some exploration of systemic racism, and some graphic references to sex and sexual conduct. I really appreciate how this story captures the pressures of high school and how that pressure becomes even more fraught when you layer on racism, prejudice, inability to access resources and inside information, and familial expectations. Henry's in a really strange place where he's able to attend this prestigious private school, which is supposed to benefit him in theory, but in reality he's still separated from his peers because he comes from a family of immigrant blue-collar workers and he doesn't have the same privileges and connections as his classmates. And he feels like his parents are pinning all their hopes and dreams on his future, as if him getting into a good school will have made their decision to immigrate be worth it, and that's already a lot of pressure as it is. And then there's the pressure of appealing to prestige, of wanting to be admired and taken seriously, which Henry doesn't feel like he can do when he wants to pursue design, especially in a world where the arts are not considered to be serious. So there's a lot of layers to the pressure Henry feels, and that pushes him to a breaking point, which is dramatic but not unrealistic, I think, and I just appreciate how the story explores that experience. I also really enjoyed the romance between Henry and Corinne. They push each other out of their comfort zones, they see things in each other that the other person can't see themselves, they have great banter, and I just thought their relationship was really sweet. I also really respect how this story doesn't go the expected route. Like, you might go into it thinking, oh, Henry's dog walking scheme is going to be exposed, or Henry and Corinne are going to fall for each other only to break up because they can't do long distance. And what happens is not those things. It's a challenging story at times, but it's ultimately about self-discovery and finding your path, and I always appreciate those things, so I gave it 4.5 stars. And the last book I listened to was my Patreon pick for February, which was Amari and the Night Brothers by B.B. Elston, read by Imani Parks. This is an Own Voices middle grade fantasy adventure story about a young black girl named Amari whose brother Quentin went missing before the story begins. No one is really searching for him because they assume he got mixed up in something dangerous, but Amari knows that can't be true, and just when she's given up hope, she goes to Quentin's closet and finds a ticking briefcase. The case is actually addressed to her, and she finds out that Quentin nominated her to join the Bureau of Supernatural Affairs, revealing that there is magic hidden all around us. If Amari can find a way to navigate the supernatural world and pass the initiation trials at the Bureau, she might just be able to find out where her brother actually went. Content warnings for some exploration of racism, bullying, and cyberbullying, grief relating to a missing family member, and allusions to an alcoholic parent. As of filming this video, I'm still currently listening to this one, so I won't be able to tell you my overall takeaway, but I can tell you what I think so far, and so far it is fantastic. I love a whimsical and imaginative fantasy adventure that offers something new and refreshing, and I'm having such a fun time going through this and witnessing Amari discovering this world that she's both immersed within and apart from at the same time. There's really great parallels of how Amari is used to being targeted and devalued at the private school she used to attend just for being a black girl from a single parent household in the projects, to now being targeted and devalued in the supernatural world because the other kids grew up in that world and she didn't. And the legacy of her brother is looming over her every step, which only further defines that disconnect because everyone assumes that she should be just as prolific as he was and that she should have inherited everything he knew, but because he kept it secret and disappeared, she never got that chance. So in many ways, it's about that steep learning curve that comes with navigating spaces that weren't created with you in mind, and that feeling of desperation that comes from being 10 steps behind everyone else's starting point. But it's also about learning to believe in your own power by removing power from the things people claim you're supposed to be, because only you get to make that choice. I think the story also plays with classic fantasy tropes like the magical trials, the chosen one, the legacy kid, and so many more in really surprising and refreshing ways that make me very excited to see where the series goes. I'm roughly 3/4 of the way through at this point, definitely on track to finish before the end of the month, and while I can't give you a rating yet, I do foresee this becoming a new favorite book. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read this past month. If you've read any of these yourself, or if you plan to, feel free to drop your thoughts down below in the comments. But that's everything I have for this wrap up today. Until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.